They say the sky only turns red during great wars or apocalyptic fires. But what if it happened without a single weapon drawn or forest set aflame? What if the sky itself was mourning, not a battle, not a disaster, but the death of a man? But Czar the Great met his end in a way that seemed written by forces far older than time. The sky turned crimson, birds fled their nests, and a quiet terror swept across the empire. His death wasn't just the fall of a king, it was the beginning of something no one understood. To this day, the events that followed continue to haunt old scrolls and frightened whispers. Let us begin at the moment the signs first appeared, when the world sensed that something powerful was about to end. On the day Czar the Great died, the heavens didn't remain silent. Dozens of servants worked in silence, striking again and again, only to see the flames sputter and die instantly. There was no wind, no moisture, and yet the fire simply refused to live. Some candles lit briefly, then snuffed themselves out, as if something invisible passed over them. In the dead of night, as they studied the moon through their brass telescopes, it happened. It split, but across the palace, darkness was spreading. The servants whispered to one another in hushed voices, afraid to speak too loudly. The flame had always obeyed them until that night. There was no sound, no shaking of the earth. But those who saw it could not sleep after that. Some tore out pages from their star charts and burned them. One of the senior sky watchers disappeared the following morning, leaving behind a note that simply read, "He is coming undone." Right before their eyes, a thin crack ran across its surface, like a blade slicing through white stone. Then, in complete silence, it drifted apart into two pale halves. They bled, and what followed, no one could explain. History has many rulers with strange endings. Some were assassinated in shadows, some vanished without a trace. Days before Czar's death, the sky watchers from his observatory sent urgent messages to the palace. They claimed to have witnessed something impossible. The separation lasted only a minute. Then the two halves slowly began to merge again, as if pulled back together by invisible hands. No one knew if he referred to the moon or the Czar. On the evening before Czar's death, as cold winds crept through the halls of the winter fortress, servants rushed to prepare his chambers. It was tradition to light the ceremonial candles across every corridor, hundreds of them casting warmth and gold across the icy stone walls. But that night, something strange happened. The candles would not light. They tried flint matches, even oil-drenched cloth. The Czar was still alive at that moment, locked inside his private chamber. And many believed it was the first true sign that something ancient had arrived to claim the life of the empire's most powerful man. That same night, just past midnight, an old guard posted outside the Czar's private chamber noticed something chilling as the moonlight streamed through the tall glass windows. It lit up the marble floor where the Czar was known to pace late into the night. The guard, curious and slightly uneasy from the candle incident, looked toward the doorway, expecting to see the long silhouette of his ruler stretching across the floor as it usually did. Czar the Great stood in front of the open window, facing the sky, but he cast no shadow. It began with the palace horses snorting wildly, kicking at stable doors until they broke free. Then came the dogs, strays, and pets, alike howling and running eastward, as if guided by a signal no human could hear. Even the royal falcons tore free from their posts and soared toward the sea. The room was silent, the air heavy, and yet the light passed straight through him, as if the world had stopped recognizing him. The guard said nothing, but quietly marked the moment in his journal, writing only one line: "A man without a shadow has 1 foot already in the grave." For centuries, songbirds had marked time, welcoming the morning, announcing dusk, but now it was as if time itself had paused. By morning, that guard had fallen unconscious, murmuring in his sleep about mirrors, stars, and voices in the walls. As dawn broke, the streets of the capital stirred with a different kind of movement, not of people, but of animals. Fishermen near the shore reported deer and wolves coming down from the forests, herding themselves into the water, swimming far out until they vanished below the surface. At first, it looked like any ordinary mist, curling over the stone bridges and drifting through the gardens. But as it reached the palace, its true nature became clear. It wasn't gray or white, it was deep red. It simply remained, pulsing slightly, as if it breathed on its own. No one could explain it. Priests said it was a curse, while farmers whispered of ancient instincts. Perhaps the creatures knew that something unnatural had entered the land. Alive, silent, and surrounded by a red mist that no one dared to name, guards who stood in it for more than a few minutes emerged coughing, their eyes red, their armor stained, as if they'd walked through smoke from a battlefield. But by mid-afternoon, not a single bird could be heard across the capital. Gardens were mute. Forests stood still. Even the lakes, usually alive with the calls of cranes and ducks, echoed with emptiness. Whatever it was, the message was clear. The natural world was in retreat, as if it no longer wished to witness what was coming next. At noon, the empire fell into an eerie silence. It began subtly, a missing chirp here, a forgotten song there. People began to gather in silence, staring at the trees and rooftops, confused and disturbed. A city without birds felt like a stage without music, waiting for a terrible scene to unfold. Mothers covered their children's ears. Old men stared at the clouds, and some whispered that this silence was not absence, was warning. As dusk fell, a thick fog rolled in from the riverbanks. It clung to the walls, wrapped around statues, and seeped through the cracks of closed windows. Despite every attempt, the fog would not disperse. No wind moved it, no fire thinned it. Priests refused to enter the palace. Even the bravest commanders stood back, making the sign of the cross. Inside the palace, the Czar still lay in his chamber. As night fell and the red fog thickened, another terrifying event shook the palace to its core. Every mirror inside the fortress, large and small, silver and glass, began to crack. One by one, without being touched, the surfaces split from corner to corner. Servants screamed as the mirrors fractured before their eyes. What disturbed them more wasn't the sound or the shards, but what they claimed to see right before the break. Not their own reflections, not the flickering candlelight, but empty rooms, empty thrones, and in some cases, a figure with no face standing behind them. By midnight, every reflective surface in the palace was shattered. Not even pools of still water would show reflections. The Tsar's personal mirror, the one he used every morning without fail, exploded into dust. The palace was blind now, and those who relied on reflections to feel human began to question if they were still real at all. As midnight approached, a bolt of lightning tore through the heavens and struck the tallest spire of the imperial cathedral. The sound shook the ground, echoing across the entire city. But the sky above remained perfectly clear. No clouds, no rain, not even a breeze. Witnesses rushed outside, expecting a storm. But there was only starlight and silence, broken by the distant crackle of fire as the golden cross atop the cathedral began to melt. Some said it was divine punishment. Others believed it was a final warning from the heavens. Either way, the cathedral bells fell silent, and a symbol of faith was reduced to smoke within minutes. That very night, priests refused to enter the chapel. One whispered to another, "The gods no longer watch us, they've turned away." At dawn, as the capital braced for what no one could explain, a new terror unfolded in the eastern sky. Instead of one sun rising over the horizon, there were three pale, glowing orbs, hovered in perfect alignment, side by side. They pulsed faintly, then shimmered as if made of liquid gold. People dropped to their knees in panic. Children cried. Some old men took it as the final sign of the end times. But just as silently as they appeared, the two outer suns began to fade. Within minutes, only the true sun remained. Still, the image was seared into the minds of everyone who saw it. The old skywatchers said they had never seen anything like it, not in charts, not in prophecy. It was as if the sky had forgotten the laws it once obeyed. As the strange suns disappeared, the rivers began to change. Starting with the river Velis, which flowed around the eastern walls of the capital. The water darkened and thickened into a deep crimson shade. Fishermen were the first to notice. Their nets came up empty, stained red. Then came the reports from bridges, where passers-by watched in silence as the river turned the color of blood. For a full hour, no one dared to approach the water. Some tried to scoop it with jars, but the liquid burned their skin faintly, as if it remembered fire. Floating down the current were the bodies of fish, belly up, their silver scales dulled and gray. The rivers bled as if the land itself mourned, and no priest could explain it, no healer could purify it. The city wells were shut down that day, and the people began whispering that the very veins of the earth had turned against them. Later that afternoon, at exactly 3:07 p.m., the great imperial clock towering above the city and chiming every hour for a century suddenly stopped. The second hand froze, the pendulum halted mid-swing, and every smaller clock in the palace followed suit. It was the same time the Czar took his last breath. The moment the heartbeat of the empire ended, clockmakers rushed to inspect the tower, only to find the gears jammed by nothing. No rust, no dust, no mechanical failure. It simply refused to move, as if time itself had acknowledged the end. To this day, the imperial clock remains frozen at that moment. No repair has worked. No effort has restarted it. It is now a silent monument, a reminder of when the pulse of power stopped and the sky began to bleed. Just as the imperial clock froze, something else began to echo through the land bells, not just from the capital, but from distant mountain monasteries, crumbling village chapels, and even long-abandoned towers. One by one, the bells began to toll. There were no hands pulling ropes, no wind stirring the towers. Yet their deep chimes rang out, perfectly in sync, across cities and forests and snow-covered plains. People stopped in the streets and looked up. In a village nearly 600 miles away, an old bell that hadn't rung in 50 years shook the ground so fiercely that cracks split its church foundation. The monks inside dropped to their knees and cried. They said the bell had once rung only at the birth of King Zand, at the death of gods. That day, it did both. And across the empire, everyone felt it. Something immense had passed through the world. Hours later, as Czar, the Great's body was prepared for its final journey, the empire's highest officials placed his crown upon his chest. The same crown he had worn through wars, treaties, and golden days of triumph. But as the procession began through the palace gates, a sound like glass breaking pierced the silence. Before the thousands of mourners, the crown split cleanly down the center, without force, without being touched. The pieces rolled off his chest, clinking against the floor. Gasps spread through the crowd. The guards froze. The priests said nothing. Too many. It was a sign one the empire was not ready to face. The symbol of authority had shattered, and with it, perhaps the idea that anyone could ever replace him. Even after the burial, no one attempted to repair it. The broken crown was locked away, hidden deep beneath the palace. It remains untouched to this day. In the days following the Tsar's death, midwives across the empire began reporting something deeply unsettling. Every child born during those 24 hours had one thing in common: eyes the color of blood. Not just red veins or light pigmentation, but irises glowing with a dull crimson hue. Some called them cursed, others called them chosen. Doctors could find no explanation. The children were otherwise healthy, but their gazes disturbed even their parents. Quiet, calm, and wide-eyed, they seemed to look through people rather than at them. By the end of the week, over 1,200 such children had been recorded. The phenomenon stopped as suddenly as it began, but strange stories followed them as they grew. Stories of hearing voices, of seeing things before they happened, and of whispering in their sleep, in languages no one understood. The night after the burial, the sky once again transformed, but not with clouds or storms. It began with a faint shimmer, like distant firelight, rising from the edge of the horizon. Then the glow expanded, slowly stretching from one end of the sky to the other. It was not the northern lights. This was deeper, redder, pulsing as if alive. Villagers in the mountains described it as a second skin of the sky. Fishermen abandoned their boats and knelt in the shallows, staring upward. The air felt warmer. The stars disappeared. Birds refused to fly. People across the empire watched in silence, knowing something had changed. Not just in their ruler's absence, but in the very fabric of the world. The next morning, deep within the imperial library, a forgotten priest uncovered a scroll sealed behind a false panel. The document, written in a dialect unused for centuries, carried a single terrifying phrase: asterisk. When the king of cold breathes no more, the sky will burn to mourn what cannot die. The priest, trembling, translated it for the council. It matched the events exactly. The red sky, the silence, the bleeding rivers, the unnatural birthmarks. But there was more. The scroll warned that the red sky was not mourning, but a veil, a sign that something trapped by the Tsar's presence had now been released. Czar the Great, it seemed, was not just a ruler. He had been a barrier, keeping something ancient, sealed, and with his death, the seal had broken. On the morning of the burial, when the pallbearers opened the sealed chamber to move the Tsar's body, they found something none of them could explain. His body was no longer flesh and bone. It had turned completely to salt. Not powder, not stone pure, solid salt, perfectly shaped in his likeness, as if frozen in his last breath. The room had not been disturbed. There were no signs of rot or decay. And yet every inch of the body had transformed. flaking slightly at the shoulders and fingertips. Panicked, the priests refused to touch it. The salt figure was wrapped in silk and entombed without ritual. They feared that disturbing it might undo whatever spell or force had preserved it. Some whispered that the salt was a punishment from forgotten gods. Others believed it was a shield so that what once lived inside the Tsar's body could not escape. That evening, stargazers across the empire raised their eyes to the heavens and found nothing. No stars, no constellations, not even the faintest sparkle. The sky was empty, completely black. For 7 nights, astronomers recorded blank skies. Their charts became useless. Telescopes revealed only still darkness, as if the universe itself had shut its eyes. Some said the stars had fled, just like the birds, just like the animals. Others believed that something larger now stood between Earth and the cosmos, something that didn't want to be seen. Whatever the truth was, the message remained terrifying. The sky was no longer watching, and perhaps it no longer wanted to. On the 7th day after the Tsar's death, a blazing object appeared above the capital, a comet, glowing white and blue, too close, too bright, but it didn't move. For over 6 hours, the comet hovered in place, directly above the imperial palace. Its long tail hung like a banner of fire in the sky, casting ghostly shadows across the city. No scientist could explain it. Comets were meant to pass, to drift, to vanish, but this one stood still, silent and terrifying. People knelt in the streets, some in prayer, others in surrender. They said it was his solor, his watcher, lingering above the place he once ruled. At dawn, it vanished. Not with a streak, not with a flash. It simply blinked out of existence. Exactly 1 year later, to the hour, the sky turned red once more. No plagues followed, no lightning struck, but the people remembered. Every clock struck 3:07 p.m. Every bell rang once, and the rivers shimmered faintly with a tint of rose. It lasted only 20 minutes, but across the empire, no one spoke, no one moved. The red light felt familiar. It was as if the sky had remembered, as if it, too, had mourned, or worse, as if something had returned to see if the world still remembered him. Even now, the anniversary is observed, not with festivals or speeches, but with silence. They say some rulers are written into the land they govern, that their breath becomes the wind, their voice the thunder, and their death a shift in the very soul of the world. Czar the Great was not just a ruler, he was a storm held in human form, and when that storm ended, the world trembled. The sky turned red, not out of grief, but out of recognition. Something immense had been present and was now gone, or perhaps had been released. We still don't know whether the red sky mourned his death or warned of what comes next. But one thing is certain, and the day Czar the Great died, the sky did not remain silent. It spoke, and its message still echoes across time.